There's a lot to say about AI, obviously, because they're trying to implement it really in every sector, from medicine to the military, to supply chain stuff, to farming even. There's huge strides being made right now, to try and take as many people out of the equation as much as possible and replace it with machines, without really having a society-wide discussion about what that really means and is that the future we really want.
Whitney Webb, welcome back to the show.
Hey, great to be back. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for being back on. I really do appreciate it. It's been over a year since we spoke, so I'm hoping that we can spend a good deal of the time today talking about the response to COVID, since we connected like right when it was first happening. But something that I did want to talk about first, because I know it was kind of a big deal for you a couple months ago, was your Patreon account and the fact that you were deplatformed off of Patreon. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that specifically, and also any kind of other social media censorship that you've experienced.
Yeah, sure. So definitely Patreon was the biggest censorship blow in that sense, because obviously it's a direct attack on my finances. So I wasn't the only person in that particular wave deplatformed from Patreon. I believe the Last American Vagabond, who I contribute to his website, and also James Corbett were also deplatformed in that same period. But what was interesting is I basically initially learned of Patreon's plans to deplatform me from an email where they claimed that I had medical misinformation that I had posted to Patreon. And then, it's sort of one of those scripted emails. So it said, here's an example of misinformation, : and then on mine, they left it blank for, I guess they didn't have an example. And so I responded, and I'm like, well, if you're going to accuse me of these things, can you at least respond with an example of something you claim to be misinformation? And then they eventually came back with a couple links to articles on my website that were never promoted or posted on Patreon. Basically, Patreon saying that they have that their opinion about what can and can't be funded with their money applies to things that aren't necessarily promoted on Patreon at all. Like they feel like they can have a right to say what's on my site and what's not in order for me to use their service, which I thought was pretty interesting. But mainly it was about articles that were critical of aspects of the vaccine rollout back in December. And the main one being their concerns about an article I wrote about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, specifically about the developer of that, Adrian Hill, and Sarah Gilbert, who was Hill's student, who run the Jenner Institute at Oxford University, who developed this vaccine, because at that time they had a pretty nasty track record of fudging safety trial results for other vaccines and other things they developed going years back. And just practices that are obviously controversial. And of course, their own Adrian Hill has some controversial ties to an institute called the Galton Institute, which is named for Sir Francis Galton, who's actually the person who created the pseudoscience field of eugenics. And the Galton Institute until 1989 was known as the British Eugenics Society. So I thought that was kind of relevant to include. And of course now, since I was deplatformed, that particular vaccine has been banned by multiple countries. And I think most recently, Canada's decided to not use that particular vaccine anymore. And I think most of the countries that have banned it are European, but it's still being promoted as the vaccine to use by COVAX, which is, the Bill Gates World Health Organization effort to vaccinate largely the global south and the third world, but they're using a vaccine that's been determined to be unsafe in developed countries, but still safe enough for the developing world, which is obviously, a double standard in that sense. And this has happened before with vaccines. And of course, these days, anytime you criticize the vaccine industry, you definitely get called a lot of names. But I think it should be pretty clear that, as an arm of the pharmaceutical industry, they do involve themselves in corruption of various types. So one example that predates COVID significantly would be the polio vaccine. So in the US now, and in developing countries, the polio vaccine is not a live virus. and that's considered to be safer. But previously, there was a live virus version of a polio vaccine that was used in the U.S., deemed to be unsafe, but now it's used it's still used, but only in the developing world, and has been found recently to cause more cases of polio than it actually prevents. So, they basically just want a market for a vaccine, regardless of whether it's proven safe or not. And more often than not, it's developing countries that get the brunt of that impact.
So just to be clear on your position there, is it specific vaccines that you're concerned about, or is it all of the COVID vaccines?
Well, it was specific vaccines I was talking about. Yeah, it was Oxford, AstraZeneca, and then I had a contributor to my site write about how the Pfizer vaccine had not been tested for use with people that are on different types of medications. So there was no, a lot of people in the U.S. and all over the world are on different types of medications that obviously interact with any sort of medical intervention, whether it's a vaccine or not. That Pfizer had conducted no studies on that. And now we know, for example, that some of the vaccines for people that are on immunosuppressant drugs aren't as effective as they had been told, and things of that nature. And so, obviously, there was a lack of study done on that, and also a lack of study on pregnant women, among other things, specifically for the Pfizer vaccine. And those were the only two vaccine candidates that we covered. So anyway, they didn't like that. And what I had asked Patreon is there a specific example? Can you point to anything in these articles that you've sent to me that are misinformation? And they said no. But we think that people that read these articles might decide not to take one of these particular vaccine candidates. I just thought that was kind of silly. I guess, they were concerned that it would fuel vaccine hesitancy. But in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, there have been a lot of cases of people getting that, enough for governments to ban its use in different countries, where, it would have been better to have this discussion back before the rollout instead of after people have, consequences as a result of it being rolled out in a way that was kind of, in my opinion, unscrupulous. So
it is funny how on social media in particular, there's a real lack of nuance. So I've even personally posted corporate media stories about people getting sick from the vaccine, and that would get kind of flagged by Facebook, and it would get the little disclaimer below it saying vaccines are tested, they're all safe, but like, here's a CBS story saying that it wasn't. So it's just very there's no nuance in social media, it seems.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to add for people that are mad at me about my reporting on this particular issue is that the reason I was very cautious and skeptical before the rollout about this stuff is because of my own personal experience during the swine flu epidemic in like 2008, 2009. I was in university. I was volunteering at a clinic, and I was told that to continue doing that volunteer thing, which I thought was important, I was going to have to get the swine flu vaccine, Pandemrix. And then also at the particular college I was going to, people that had gotten sick for whatever reason that were, thought to have swine flu were all being quarantined in these apartments, and they were all talking. I had friends there, and they were all talking about how awful it was, and that freaked me out. So I didn't want to get sent to that for on-campus housing and stuff. And so I ended up taking it. And I definitely had major, really nasty side effects from a vaccine back then that studies have shown, a decade after the fact, was totally rushed and has been linked to narcolepsy and a lot of neurological problems. I believe it was developed by GlaxoSmithKline, and there was never any accountability for that. I basically was passed out with a super high fever for 2 days. I probably should have been in the hospital. And I ended up having to drop out of a course or two that semester because it took me forever to recover, really. So, obviously when there's a crisis of fear and people are being pushed and prodded, in particular ways to take a medical intervention without having all the facts, I'm just personally really wary of that. And I saw a lot of that stuff that had been repeated, in swine with the swine flu crisis, taking place once again with COVID, but in a much more exaggerated and much more large scale way than, a decade prior. So, that's part of why I've been so skeptical about it. But, people that have had adverse reactions to vaccines, these days can get called conspiracy theorists just for talking about their own personal experience. So an example of that would be Eric Clapton, the famous guitarist. Got the AstraZeneca vaccine, came out and said that he had awful after effects from it, and then a day or two later he was called a conspiracy theorist just for talking about his own experiences with the vaccine. And I don't think that's really fair, and I think the lack of nuance is damaging, but I think it's just shows how COVID in a lot of ways was used to continue, at least in the US, the polarization of the Trump era. If you aren't on board with a lot of the government recommended interventions and all of this stuff, then you're a Trumper and what have you. And there's a lot of rhetoric that seems to fall into that camp, and I don't really think that's healthy if what we're actually trying to deal with are public health issues as opposed to political issues. So.
Well, again, the last time that we spoke was at the start of the COVID pandemic, and you kind of voiced some of your concerns about what the reaction might be. I guess I'm wondering, just looking back a year later, have things kind of panned out the way that you may have feared that they would? Have things turned out a little better now that things seem to be opening up again? And just overall, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the general response to the COVID pandemic over the past year?
I know back then I was definitely really concerned about the impact on civil liberties. And I think in the US, obviously with things opening up in most states, it's not necessarily as bad as it is some places, but you have to keep in mind too that the response to COVID has been very differently in different countries. I recently had to leave Chile. Last time we spoke, I was still living in Chile and planned to be there for the foreseeable future. I ended up having to leave just because of how excessive the quarantines still are there, more than 15 months after emergency measures were first introduced. Basically in Chile, if almost the entire population, by the way, right now is living this reality, the phase 1 quarantine, as they call it. You have to get police permission to leave your house. You're only allowed to do that twice a week, and those permissions only last 2 hours a pop. So you're only allowed out of your home basically for 4 hours in a week. There's a mask mandate for both outdoors and indoors for everyone that's not an infant. So my 3-year-old daughter had to be in a mask constantly in order to comply with law. If you don't wear a mask, people scream at you on the street. It's a really intense climate of fear over there. And, the whole thing of having to go through the police for all this stuff is really crazy. All the childcare was shut down. There was no stimulus for Chileans, unlike the US and a lot of other countries. Instead, people were allowed to raid their privatized pension funds, which are already a source of controversy in Chile. More recently, they've offered a little more in terms of finances, probably just to avoid total revolt. But basically, it's crippled the economy where I was living, which was mostly a tourist-based economy. There's not going to be tourism there anymore, and these measures will probably continue in Chile for the foreseeable future. And have, basically people in Chile have just taken it, even though, a lot of other countries haven't gone to the extremes Chile has gone and have a better COVID situation, like the US, for example. Even in states that impose quarantines, they were never severe as the one in Chile. And Chile is one of the most vaccinated countries on the planet, I think just behind the UK and Israel in terms of the amount of vaccine uptake, and still they're living this reality day to day. It's honestly pretty extreme. For me, I had to leave because I couldn't get childcare. I would have had to have left taken one of the weekly permissions out on a Monday and the other one out on a Friday, and leave my kid somewhere for 5 days with a babysitter. And that was not really feasible. And childcare has been shut down this whole time. I feel really bad for families that didn't live in a rural area like I did, because I actually had a yard and stuff. My kid could be outside, while this was going on. But people that live in Santiago or some of the bigger cities and live in small apartments, them and their children have been closed up in there this whole time. Literally no discussion in Chilean media of the mental health this has had, particularly on children who haven't been allowed to interact with other children really at all for long periods of time, and how that's going to affect them and all of that. So, I definitely think in some countries where they felt like they could get away with it, the destruction of civil liberties has been as far as people would let that be taken. I think in the U.S. and the U.K. and some other countries, they've been a little more cautious, given that people have that there's been more resistance to some of these policies, and they're more careful about how far they go. But I think more broadly globally, there has been a loss of civil liberties worldwide. A lot of emergency measures continue to be in place. And in places where they've been relaxed, for example, in the U.S., you have the launching of a war of domestic terror, which I wrote about recently, isn't going to be used just for people on the right, which tend to also, in the American political climate, tend to be associated with people that rebuke COVID-related measures, but also people on the left as well. So, that's obviously going to lead to a massive erosion on civil liberties, but from a different angle, not from a public health angle, but from a public safety angle. And I think a lot of these governments will try and continue to keep these measures in place for as long as they can. And I think there's, of course, been a huge push towards making everything digital, moving everything to the virtual realm, like teleworking to a big degree. I think for a lot of businesses is going to remain. A Zoom school is likely to remain as well. And of course, this plays into the hands of Silicon Valley, that is in this desperate mad rush to outcompete other Silicon Valley companies or their competitors abroad, for who can develop the best AI algorithms faster and be market leaders in this new AI automation space. Because following that theory, the more data you feed into an AI, supposedly the better your algorithm will be, right? So the more data you can accumulate, the better your AI products will be. This is how these people are operating. Of course, we know in the US, Silicon Valley has an insane amount of political power. They're very deeply connected to the intelligence community and also the military. They're contractors for both. And, it was Eric Schmidt who was basically in charge of charting national security AI policy for the entire government. So that's definitely disconcerting as well. But on the political sphere, the DNC, their committee is just stuffed with former Silicon Valley people from Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, all of these companies. So obviously, they have a lot of pull in the U.S. So I think, even if COVID restrictions are relaxed, a lot of sort of the end game that we saw sort of begin to be implemented under the guise of combating COVID, specifically that push for more stuff in the virtual world, will continue. And this obviously plays into the hands of the government as well, because the more that goes on online, or the more things that are tech-based, the more easily it is to surveil and track and all of that. So there definitely, I think that push is going to continue as well. And of course, this all plays into the hands of this, what is often called the Great Reset, though I think some people sort of roll their eyes at that term maybe. But it definitely is true that there is this, we are in the midst of this, what the World Economic Forum terms the fourth industrial revolution, which is basically the introduction of automation, different forms of biotechnology that haven't really been around before, and really, technologies that are going to very, very much disrupt the workforce. And I think if it hadn't been introduced during the COVID-19 crisis, it would have been much harder to convince people to adopt them and to undergo those radical, changes in lifestyle that those technologies bring.
And just to touch on that for a moment, so could you highlight what your concerns are about AI specifically? Because I think sometimes it gets sold as a positive, well, often it gets sold as a positive thing to the, to the citizenry. And I think one example of that is Andrew Yang and the whole idea of UBI and the fact that we won't have to work as much. So could you maybe just go into a little more detail on what your concerns are about AI?
Right. Well, UBI is a separate thing, right? And Andrew Yang, for progressives that are really into UBI, it's worth pointing out that Andrew Yang himself has admitted this goes back to an idea for Milton Friedman. And the idea of UBI is that you have UBI, but all existing social services and that social safety net are gutted and replaced by the UBI. So it's not exactly even as Andrew Yang attempted to pitch it to Democrat voters in the last election cycle, it's not exactly as progressive as maybe you've been led to believe. But in terms of AI, obviously they have the people that produce it have a vested interest in making people think that it'll make life more convenient and better. But I think ultimately it's about control, being able to micromanage people's lives and how they go about their daily business in a way that doesn't necessarily involve that many people. They can have algorithms managing and watching a lot of this stuff, and are able to control the masses to a much more intense degree with fewer people. And that makes sense, as we're seeing, because of the pandemic, wealth concentrate in much fewer hands than ever before. A massive wealth transfer has undeniably taken place while this has gone on. So it would make sense for them to want to be able to maintain the new status quo, not unlike after 2008. You saw a lot of protests, of course, Occupy Wall Street and what have you after that wealth transfer. But this time, under the guise of the pandemic, another massive wealth transfer on that same scale has taken place, if not bigger. But not a lot of protests because they've been able to do it under the guise of pandemic relief, which of course was managed by BlackRock, one of the world's biggest asset managers, that now is buying up real estate across the U.S. And just being predatory like they've always been. They're a big partner of the World Economic Forum, by the way. But in terms of artificial intelligence itself, they like to say that it's highly accurate and can do all this stuff. But a lot of that, those statistics rely on what the companies that produce the algorithms themselves say in terms of accuracy, and they haven't really been scrutinized by independent experts or independent groups of really any sort. So it's really just one of those things of take the company's word for it. In the case of, for example, facial recognition AI, we know that they have a huge racial bias. And that there's been, efforts to sort of fix that, and it hasn't gone away. There was a really prominent female programmer at Google who I think was head of their ethics in AI thing. I forget her name, sorry. But towards the end of last year, she was forced out of Google for saying that these racial biases in AI are never going to be eradicated, essentially. And it does kind of make sense when you think of it, what I mentioned earlier, sort of this race by these Silicon Valley companies to just dump as much data into these to train these algorithms as possible without really caring that much about the quality of the data that's put in. Because when that happens, if you think about all the data that's around the internet, a lot of the stuff on the internet is crazy. There's a lot of stuff on there that not everyone consumes. That's considered fringe or whatever, inappropriate for a lot of audiences. And so if you're dumping all of that into these algorithms, obviously you're going to get some odd results, perhaps, because it's not exactly a reflection of what everyone thinks or exactly how the real world works, what's on the internet necessarily. If you take it in terms of the amount of content that's on the internet, as an example, what if you have a person who's quote unquote normal, who only posts a small amount of things, but then you have a person who's totally nuts, who has like 6 web pages and posts all over the place constantly. Obviously their content's going to be overrepresented, right? We've seen this before too with Microsoft, for example, attempting to introduce an AI chatbot online, and within 24 hours it was it was spouting like Nazi slogans and saying all this really inappropriate stuff. It doesn't really take long for AI to be derailed and in that sense. So I mean, I think they're really overselling its effectiveness to a significant degree, and it definitely does have a lot of issues when it comes to bias and all of this stuff. And what's really concerning is that we see the push for smart cities going on, and facial recognition is a huge part of that. So the fact that these biases are there, and people have in these companies themselves have raised the alarm that that isn't going to go away, and they're actually forced out of those companies for saying so, I think is really alarming, that given that we're seeing this push to make law enforcement in the military also very focused on in the coming years on virtual reality, on AI stuff, on facial recognition, and all of these big tech emerging technologies that have AI at their root, definitely is cause for concern. But it goes beyond that. Also, in the sense of AI, obviously, a lot of people know that it's going to cost them their jobs. And people like Jeff Bezos, for example, have been pretty open about that in the past several years. If he could replace every Amazon warehouse worker with a robot, he would in a second. I think that's pretty obvious if you're familiar with Jeff Bezos and his business model, and how they treat Amazon workers. Basically treat them like robots, assuming they don't need bathroom breaks or anything like, anything that regular people actually need. So that's going to be increasingly common. We're seeing a lot of companies already moving towards that. And of course, with all of the restrictions that are being placed on people in the post-COVID era, not in every industry, but in some industries, that you either have to take regular COVID screenings or things like that, or there might have to be insurance for companies that are employing people in certain ways. Some companies may find it more profitable to move towards automation and robots than to have people who can get sick and injured and be liabilities and all of this stuff. So definitely a lot of the corporations that have become really powerful, even more powerful over the crisis of the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, I think we'll see them try and automate much more than they've already done. And obviously that's going to have major consequences for employment, what you do with all those unemployed people. And this is, these technologies have been known about for years, well before COVID. To think the elite haven't been thinking about how to handle this problem or how to solve it from their end to maintain the status quo, I think is honestly pretty naive, because these people do get together to think about how to protect the status quo and their wealth at the expense of everyone else. Hopefully that answers your question. I mean, there's a lot to say about AI, obviously, because they're trying to implement it really in every sector, from medicine to the military to supply chain stuff to farming even. There's huge strides being made right now to try and take as many people out of the equation as much as possible and replace it with machines, without really having a society-wide discussion about what that really means and is that the future we really want.
That is a good point. We tell ourselves that we live in a democratic system, but when we're handing over the infrastructure of society to AI, there really isn't much public debate on that whatsoever.
Right. And I think that's a big problem, and I wish more people would pay attention to that particular side of this issue, because it's obviously happening right now, but isn't really being touched by a lot of people. A lot of these billionaires in Silicon Valley specifically have a vested interest in this being the future, but it's not. If you look at how far they want to take this technology, even in the context of transhumanism and stuff like that. I mean, it's really important that people are informed about where this leads, unless we stop this to some degree, or slow it down so we can actually talk about the impacts it's going to have.
What is transhumanism? What does that mean?
Okay, so transhumanism, I guess, to most people, would be this effort to sort of merge humans with machines. Transhumanists view that merger as the pinnacle of human evolution, that humans have already evolved as far as they're going to evolve in nature, and that the next stage is to merge with machine intelligence, and go that route. But unfortunately, if you actually look into the history of the term, and I'm sure there's people that are enthusiasts about transhumanist technology that may not know this, the term itself was coined in a book in the late 50s by Julian Huxley, who at the time was one of the main people at the Eugenics Society, and he basically said that transhumanism, is the new eugenics, and there are people in the Galton Institute, what the Eugenics Society is known as today, including David Galton, who's on their board, who wrote a book called Eugenics in the 21st Century, talking about how a lot of this, transhumanist technology and gene editing and CRISPR and all of this stuff was going to usher in a new era, the golden age of eugenics and all of this stuff. That's really disconcerting. But a lot of transhumanist enthusiasts do tend to have an overlapping interest in eugenics, at least when you get up into the elite circles of people who promote this. I mean, probably the best example I can give is Jeffrey Epstein, because it's been admitted in mainstream media that he was both a massive enthusiast in transhumanist technology, funding for, among other organizations, the World Transhumanist Association, now known as Humanity Plus, who's the people in charge of that are responsible for like Sophia the robot, among other things. And of course was also had a very outspoken interest in eugenics. Jeffrey Epstein, as I reported recently in my article about him and the true nature of his relationship with Bill Gates, which has not been covered by mainstream media, was very much involved with Microsoft as a company, and several of their executives who appear to have been compromised by Epstein, not just Bill Gates. And of course, a lot of things we see at Microsoft, including with Bill Gates, are ties to sort of eugenics related institutions, and also an interest in transhumanist brain-machine interfaces and all of this stuff. And of course, brain-machine interfaces you may have heard mostly from Elon Musk, for example, but a former Microsoft executive who runs, I think it's called Valve Entertainment, which is responsible for a lot of video games, has said that brain-machine interface is going to be the future of video games in the next couple of years, and all of this stuff. That's definitely very invasive, invasive technology, and would definitely, be. I think it's pretty obvious, even though this obviously isn't included in the sales pitch, will be abused by national security agencies, whether it's of the country you're living in or an adversary of theirs abroad. Having that technology in people's brains and being able to manipulate people's brains with machines will obviously, or surveil their thoughts, among those things, will open up a very dystopian Orwellian era that I don't think people really want. So obviously a lot of transhumanist technology is sold as being able to augment humans and their abilities, but it obviously comes with a cost. That's pretty significant. And some people that are closely associated with the World Economic Forum, like Yuval Noah Harari, have basically said that as soon as governments are capable of, in businesses, really anyone with this type of power is capable of surveilling people's thoughts, then we are just forever in the era of digital dictatorships. And he's saying this to the crowd at Davos and in the beginning of 2020. So this is something the elite know, and I think it's pretty clear that they would favor a future where the people, the underlings, as it were sort of controlled in a way that where they didn't threaten their the status quo, the current level of wealth distribution, and things like that, as opposed to having to deal with actual dissent, or deal with, actual representative government. I don't think they're really interested in having to give up the pieces, the large piece of the pie they've cut for themselves.
I did have one last question in regards to COVID, because one large shift that we've seen in the media narrative regarding COVID is about the Wuhan lab leak. And this was really exemplified by Jon Stewart's recent appearance on Stephen Colbert's show. And I think that we've also seen in the corporate media as well this embrace of the Wuhan lab leak theory, whereas last year this was really seen as a Trump talking point, and I think attacked for that reason. So I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit, just how the corporate media is now seemingly embracing that theory.
Right. Well, yeah, they seem to be embracing that theory, and the timing of the shift, and the obviousness of the shift, I think, is pretty interesting, for sure. I think a lot of it may have to do with just efforts to pressure China. I think in terms of the U.S. power elite, there's a couple of different factions. There's the China hawks, who of course are pretty well representative on the right side, and also in the military, who for years have wanted to challenge China, viewing them as the biggest threat to American hegemony, both militarily and economically. But then you have another side that's sort of the leader of this, I would say, is probably Henry Kissinger, but there's a lot of people that fall in this category as well, like Eric Schmidt, for example, who's being called the new Kissinger. People like Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone Capital, people that are associated with the Berggruen Institute, among other groups that tend to view an alternative to sort of that hawkishness with China as working with China to basically build sort of this global infrastructure based on a lot of these technologies and sort of collaborate rather than compete. But there have been people in China that haven't wanted to collaborate with the US, and I can get into that a little bit with regards to the Wuhan Institute, because I think there's a lot that's been left out of the reporting there. So for example, the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the reporting that's gone on, they've mainly talked about, they've mainly avoided talking about the extreme and obvious ties of the U.S. and U.S. government funding to that particular institution. For example, EcoHealth Alliance is one of the main partners specifically for coronavirus research at that institute. EcoHealth Alliance, their main funders are actually the Pentagon and USAID or USAID, which a lot of people correctly point out basically operates like a CIA cutout. For all intents and purposes, even though it's technically, I believe, funded by the State Department. So it's pretty interesting that you would have the State Department entity basically giving tons of funding, millions in funding to this institute that has now been flagged as, at least by mainstream media now, as the source of the leak. That hasn't been discussed. One of EcoHealth Alliance's main advisors is a guy named David Franz, who is a former commander at Fort Detrick, collaborated closely with Judith Miller in terms of promoting fake WMD lies about Iraq and trying to pin the anthrax attacks on Saddam Hussein. So he actually visited the Wuhan lab in 2017, was calling for greater collaboration in the transport and of pathogens between the U.S. and China, sharing strain collections, sharing decision making about how gain of function research, which is when you you experiment to create a pathogen that's more transmissible or more infectious than it would be in nature. All of this stuff was being discussed about Fort Detrick. There's other people associated with the national security state sort of in this space in the U.S. with respect to China that have criticized China for not wanting to collaborate more in this sort of field of dual-use biodefense, biowarfare experimentation that a lot of people in the U.S., including the person that wrote the Biological Weapons Convention, Francis Boyle, have for years said that the U.S. has really been blatantly violating that convention through a lot of its gain of function research that goes on also in the U.S. domestically. It is worth pointing out, too, that we don't exactly know if the origin of COVID-19 happened in Wuhan. For example, there's been reports that COVID-19 appeared in, of course, this came out over the past year, not when we first spoke, but was discovered was found in people in Europe months prior, and also that the vaping illness that we were hearing about in the U.S. There was apparently some study linking that, saying that was actually COVID-19, and this is all before October, November, December of 2020, when mainstream media now says, if you believe the lab theory about Wuhan, that's when that particular leak would have taken place. So there's definitely a lot that hasn't really come out there, and it's worth pointing out too, that in 2019, Fort Detrick was actually shut down for numerous safety breaches, including 2 breaches of pathogens. They won't say what they were in the Maryland, and of course that's in Maryland. Obviously could have impacted things. I mean, we don't really know. But the fact that Congress wasn't notified is really alarming. And, I wrote a lot about Fort Detrick last year, and how these types of safety breaches are increasingly have been common for decades. That they're just very willy-nilly with the way they handle these types of deadly pathogens. And of course, the anthrax attacks themselves, I think, are pretty instructive too about this type of experimentation and behavior, and also people that were either apparently involved in those attacks, or definitely involved in the cover-up, over the course of the COVID crisis in the U.S. were actually involved in COVID-19 policy to a significant degree, including under Trump, the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response at HHS, Robert Kadlec, who I've written about considerably, has a lot of really shady ties and a shady past. And he, of course, was responsible for giving that COVID-19 contract to Emergent Biosolutions that I think should be investigated for their role in the anthrax attacks as well. They were actually given a contract when they never should have been for the COVID-19 vaccines, and then it comes out a couple months later that they totally decimated millions of batches of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, making it unusable, essentially because they are an extremely corrupt business that doesn't care about safety at all. And actually the person they had put in charge of quality control at that particular facility had no background in that field at all, and was actually a career military spook in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Iran and North Korea. So, I mean, it's just pretty ridiculous. And, I definitely got called a lot of names for bringing that up before it became an issue. But, the pharmaceutical industry, including people that produce and manufacture vaccines, are corrupt. Pfizer, for example, just has a litany of abuses tied to its name that precede COVID-19. A lot of people decided not to care or worry about that, and give these people no liability for anything that these that these products might do. And if you're going to give no liability to a company that's like either Emergent Biosolutions in that case, or Pfizer, or any of these other guys with a long record of abuses, they're probably going to take advantage of that, at least to some degree.
So you mentioned how recently the U.S. government put out some additional instruction regarding who is a domestic terrorist or domestic violent extremist, I believe is their terminology. And it's funny because I think that originally this may have been sold as, the Biden administration being vigilant against right-wing extremists, especially in the wake of the January 6th riot at the Capitol. However, if you actually look at the guidance, it's pretty much anyone who may oppose the government for any reason. So they mention animal rights activists, they mention opponents to capitalism, they mention people who think that the government may be corrupt. So really just the gambit of any reason whatsoever where you may have a problem with the government apparently makes you a domestic violent extremist. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit on that guidance and what the ramifications of it may be.
Yeah, so the war on domestic terror is not something that just Biden started. This is something that's been the U.S. establishment has been trying to implement for decades. In terms of what we're seeing now, that policy really has its roots in the Reagan administration, as this very controversial aspect of the Iran-Contra scandal that's known as continuity of government protocols, and a database that basically contains a lot of intelligence on innocent Americans who are deemed as to be dissidents by the states. That database is known as Main Core. It still exists today. Basically, it was originally created during the Reagan era because they wanted to potentially detain people in the U.S. that they thought would resist U.S. military intervention in Nicaragua, or more broadly in Latin America, during the Reagan years. And one of the trigger events they cite for implementing continuity of government protocol, which is suspension of the Constitution, martial law, and all of that stuff, in addition to detaining people who haven't committed a crime for their political views. They did say that popular nonviolent opposition to a U.S. military intervention abroad fell in that category, which is very disconcerting. But of course, it didn't get a lot of coverage. Some of the people involved in continuity of government were in the Reagan administration when it first started, were people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who were in power in the Bush administration. Allegedly, continuity of government protocols were activated for an unspecified amount of time in the wake of September 11th. And of course, after 9/11 in the White House, people saw Main Corps being accessed at the White House for whatever reason. It later came out that apparently Main Corps was used to increase surveillance and among other things that we don't know happened of potential, subversives and dissidents in the U.S. after 9/11 for whatever reason. But of course, before 9/11, you had this major pivot by people that would again serve in the Bush administration, people like Richard Armitage, for example, the National Defense Panel in 1997, basically being responsible for this pivot towards homeland defense and homeland security in the late 90s that definitely got the national security state moving in the years leading up between then and 9/11 to basically develop this pivot towards homeland defense. That's why months before 9/11 took place, legislation was actually introduced to create what is now the Department of Homeland Security. Originally, it was the National Homeland Security Agency, I believe, is proposed in that legislation. I believe was introduced in either March or May of 2001, because this pivot was planned, well in advance, regardless of 9/11 or not. But obviously 9/11 did manufacture consent for the implementation of something like the Department of Homeland Security, as it's now called. But I would argue, if you look at Richard Armitage, for example, who was responsible for this, Richard Armitage's history with in U.S. politics, in the Bush administration, he was a major advisor on foreign policy in the war on terror. But, in his earlier career, he was involved in a CIA domestic dissident, or rather dissident hunting program in Vietnam called the Phoenix Program that was basically laid a lot of the groundwork for what later the Reagan administration would secretly plan to try and do in the U.S. domestically, right? So a lot of people that were involved in the Phoenix Program for various reasons were also involved in these efforts to create the Department of Homeland Security. You can only imagine why they thought that might be necessary, but obviously they didn't like having domestic dissent about their policies, specifically when they feel like these policies are essential to things like maintaining American military and economic hegemony into the foreseeable future, which is something, for example, the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC, which of course also had Cheney, Rumsfeld, and a lot of the Paul Wolfowitz and a lot of the guys that planned the Iraq War and were very prominent in the Bush administration, said very explicitly in this document called Rebuilding America's Defenses in September 2000 that a bunch of things had to change and be done in order for the U.S. to maintain hegemony, and that there would need to be a galvanizing, catalyzing event, a new Pearl Harbor, for those things to be basically, pushed through on a much shorter timeline than it would take otherwise. More recently, under the Trump administration, we saw a lot of moves to, obviously you have a lot of people from the Bush and Reagan administrations also serving in the Trump administration, right? So you had this policy advance to a significant degree as well, specifically thanks to Bill Barr at the Department of Justice, who introduced a pre-crime program that a lot of people don't know about. I wrote about it when it was first announced in October 2019 for Mint Press News. I think literally the only other outlet that covered it was the Ron Paul Liberty Report. No one else was very interested in the story at the time. Of course, that was implemented just a few months later at the beginning of 2020. It's called DEEP. The Disruption and Early Engagement Program, I believe is what it stands for. And sort of this pre-crime approach and all of that, and DEEP as well. A few months before DEEP was announced, Bill Barr gave a speech saying we need a backdoor into encryption, and we basically need pre-crime. But it's not popular. But sometime soon there will be a galvanizing event that will rally Americans around these things. And then there was, of course, we had a spate of mass shootings shortly after that, including the El Paso Walmart shooting, which has very unsettling, unanswered questions about FBI foreknowledge as well, that I also wrote about for Mint Press at the time. And then you have Bill Barr come in with the solution to those crises with the DEEP program. And during that period as well, Trump was also considering creating a health DARPA agency, or HARPA, that was specifically going to monitor Americans' communications, specifically on social media, for signs of neuropsychiatric neuropsychiatric warning signs that someone might be mobilizing towards violence for whatever reason, which is, and of course that was actually going to be AI that was managing that. And actually Biden just a couple months ago announced that they're going to be doing HARPA, though they might call it ARPA-H instead of HARPA, and that the science advisor for the Biden administration, the main one, Eric Lander, who was funded by Jeffrey Epstein and is controversial for numerous reasons, as I've written about recently, is going to be in charge of that effort and will obviously be rolled into this war on domestic terror as Biden has outlined it. So Trump didn't adopt that policy, but Biden is going to. And of course, you also had during the Trump administration lots of calls from his supporters to go after Antifa, quote unquote, terrorists and all of this stuff on the left. And then you have people at the time, too, in Congress on the Republican side pushing legislation to criminalize, what was going on there, while you have people on the left later, with January 6th and all of this, calling for people on the right to be labeled terrorists. For a number of reasons, and you definitely have it coming from both sides of the political party, this push to label people on the other side of the political spectrum terrorists, right? So but really what the national security state wants at the end of the day is that anyone, the justification to really go after anyone who's a threat to the status quo and a threat to their power. And so that's what we see in the it's interesting because Biden brags about all the time how he's always been so good about working with the other party and reaching across the aisle, right? And you really see that here in this domestic terror strategy, how the people that the GOP think are terrorists and the people that the Democrats think are terrorists are all labeled terrorists together in this new document. And basically, as the U.S. has done before with the war on terror, it's just ripe for abuse to a significant degree. And as you mentioned, it's been publicly justified as the Biden administration going after domestic extremists that are right-leaning or racially motivated. But if you read the strategy, which I really recommend everyone does, it says on par with those extremists are people deemed by the government to be anti-government or anti-authority for a variety of reasons. And when they actually get to the business of explaining who they think anti-authority and anti-government extremists are, a lot of people that are on the left would fall in there, specifically socialists or people, communists, people that oppose capitalism or want to replace it with another system fall in that category, according to the Biden administration. So a lot of people, on the left that have bought the public justification for what this is for, I would really encourage them to look at this strategy seriously and then revisit the history of these types of campaigns as they've been conducted in other countries backed by the U.S. government, like Operation Condor and the Phoenix program, which were used to go after the left. And with the full backing of the U.S. government. Operation Condor, for example, was a multinational domestic dissident elimination campaign that went on in the military dictatorships of Chile, Argentina, Brazil, I believe Peru, and several other countries in South America cooperated with this, but it was all planned by the CIA. The targets were people that were either leftists, communists, socialists, or suspected leftists. And so, having lived in Chile and heard a lot of stories from Chileans about this period of history that didn't end so long ago, people could just be disappeared by the state for being accused of leftist sympathies, among other things. If someone hated their neighbor and wanted them to just go away, they'd just say whatever and it would happen. So it's really disconcerting. And we've also seen, statements from the Biden administration about the role of family members and friends basically snitching on people they think are too extreme or have the wrong political views as part of this war on domestic terror. And I really would encourage people to study the history because the U.S. has done this in other countries before, and it has never been pretty, either for civil liberties or for the left, which is currently people that identify as left tend to be the people that are cheerleading this war on domestic terror from the Biden administration more than anyone else. So I would really caution them against that. And that's really why I made a focus of my more recent article on this, about that in particular, because this is not about going after quote unquote right-wing terror. This is about going after anyone that could, present any sort of a threat to the U.S. establishment as it enters this phase where, the business sector and all of this is going to move towards automation. There's going to be a lot more economic inequality, even more than there is now, especially with a lot of the economic issues that the U.S. is facing, including creeping inflation, among other things. So it's definitely, the U.S. government is aware that things are going to get rockier down the line, and they want this infrastructure in place because they don't want people to come together and make a new system that challenges their power, right? So they have a specific system they want to implement, and they don't want people to get in the way of that, essentially. And I really think that's where this war on domestic terror comes from. And also, I think we may see some sort of event that is aimed at basically manufacturing consent for this to be implemented on a more broad, more public level, because I think a lot of people right now aren't really, the fear levels aren't high enough for a system like this to work. I think it needs some sort of like 9/11 style event for people to really get on board with a big war on domestic terror and have this play out the way it's been written out. But, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the stuff, the policies that were implemented after 9/11 were introduced months before 9/11, right? So, that's definitely a concern to me, that I think that if, the national security state feels like they don't have enough consent from the public to implement this policy, or at least a particular sector of the public, they'll go to extreme lengths to get that consent. Whatever that looks like, I don't really know. But it's definitely a concern of mine, because this is obviously a policy they plan to implement and an infrastructure they want to put in place, and that they plan to put in place. They've already earmarked lots of money for it, and already set things up. And this is also, by the way, something that is not just exclusive to the government. The strategy makes it clear that this is all being done in collaboration with the private sector, and Silicon Valley. It emphasizes the tech sector, but the private sector is going to be involved as well. So you mentioned animal rights activists being put on this list as well. What if, big ag, feedlots and all of that stuff will be like, oh, these are people that have broken in and filmed the bad conditions that in which we house animals, and they get added to the domestic terror list. I mean, this collaboration between the public and private sector on something of this degree is not really good, obviously, because, it definitely, if it's not outright fascism, it's certainly something quite close to it when you're basically, colluding with the private sector to put people on a list that could lead to the loss of their liberty, or even their life, depending on how extreme this ends up getting. So definitely a lot to be concerned about here, because once we give the government this sort of power, it's very rare for it to come back. Even in the wake of 9/11, a lot of the security measures that were implemented at airports that have been proven to be just for show, really, or obedience training in the years since, were never taken away. The no-fly list was allowed to continue to exist despite it being untransparent, and people that are put on there having no way to appeal how to get off easily. Among other things, a lot of these losses of civil liberties that happened during the war on terror were never returned, though it wasn't necessarily obvious to people domestically, but I think this time it definitely will be. And the U.S. public is going to be in a very dicey place if they don't learn the history of this quickly, because the U.S. government has shown its cards before on who it likes to target and what it plans to do in these types of scenarios, and in these wars of, domestic terror and what have you. And so, if you agree that the war on terror was a disaster, why would you give, the same people essentially license to do it domestically, where it's going to directly impact your life and your family's life? It doesn't really make any sense to me.
So another thing that I wanted to ask you about is, recently in the news, there's been a lot of focus on UFOs. And I know that some people have been kind of suspicious and skeptical of all of that focus lately. I'm just wondering what your take on that has been.
Well, sure. So I'm not going to get in the business of saying I know exactly what the UFOs are, what people's personal experiences or whatever. That's not what I'm trying to comment on. But I do want to stress that the reason this buzz has been generated recently is because of this upcoming report on UFOs that is being produced by a task force at the Pentagon in direct collaboration with the U.S. intelligence community. For people that read my work, they will know that the institutions I trust the least are probably the military and the intelligence community in the U.S. So I definitely will be, and I encourage other people to be as well, extremely skeptical of what the findings of that report ultimately are. I recently did a podcast on this, but it's important to point out that regardless of how they frame these UFOs, they've only really given two possibilities, right? It can either be Russia or Chinese technology that's too advanced and more advanced than our military's technology, and that's why we don't know anything about it. Or it's of a non-Earth origin, right? Are the two possibilities that have been fielded. Notice that, it can be Russia and China's advanced military technology, but nowhere will they say, well, maybe it's U.S. black budget, secret U.S. military technology. I think, not having that as an option is worth pointing out as well, because, we can't exactly trust the Pentagon or the CIA to be open about their black budget programs, because they never have been before. So obviously, if Russia and China would have them, the U.S. most certainly has them, as do their allies. So I'll just leave it at that. But beyond that, but by having these two possibilities in the way it's been framed on mainstream news as well, is that regardless of whether it's Earth origin or non-Earth origin, the issue is that this technology is more advanced than our current military technology, so we must give the military more money to develop better technology, yes, and to develop things that could mitigate this threat of the unknown technology. So, I argued in a recent podcast that a lot of this plays into the hands of a very old agenda that goes back to the Reagan administration once again, where they implemented the so-called Star Wars program, officially known as the SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative, which was basically, used the Soviet Union as the boogeyman then to justify militarizing space, essentially, and being able to blow up anything, any point on the world from space, allegedly, so they could blow up any sort of missile that was launched before it reached its destination. But of course, it obviously, if it has a defensive use, it has an offensive use as well. It's oftentimes the military, when they justify these new frontiers, I guess you could say, in technology and in warfare, they tend to frame it as defensive rather than offensive, but they certainly have both in mind when they plan this stuff out. It would be naive, I think, to think otherwise. And actually, beyond the Reagan administration, they attempted to go even further with the militarization of space and developing these things. So there was a program called Breaking Pebbles that continued briefly into the Clinton administration before it was defunded, because the Clinton administration actually accurately recognized that it violated a lot of their weapons conventions with the Soviet Union and internationally as well. Well, at that point, it was Russia, I guess, not the Soviet Union. But anyway, it violated international law, so they withdrew from that program. And of course, the people at Project New American Century, that document I mentioned earlier, Rebuilding America's Defenses, one of the things it says is necessary in order for the U.S. to maintain U.S. Military hegemony into the foreseeable future is to dominate space before anyone else does. And they make this very explicit in that document. If you're interested in more information that specifically, I recommend my podcast on this with Robbie Martin that's now public. Because we go into a lot more detail there. But, it's definitely been something that the U.S. military has wanted to do for a long time. And, while the U.S. military was working on these efforts, ever since the Reagan administration, there have been private companies that have popped up hoping to be the main contractor for them. First, it was a Bill Gates venture in the 90s called Teledesic that was going to basically do what Starlink does now. Teledesic folded in 2002. That's the same year that SpaceX, Elon Musk company, company launches, and now you have SpaceX and Starlink being now intimately connected with U.S. Space Force, which, by the way, Space Force was not Trump's idea. Space Force is actually called for in this PNAC neocon document, Rebuilding America's Defenses. It says very explicitly in 2000 there needs to be a U.S. Space Force. And so that's where Trump got the idea from. It wasn't his idea. This is a very old agenda that goes back a long time. But, I think what we'll see now, especially as you see a lot of the launching of low orbit satellites to literally envelop the Earth, that's what Starlink and SpaceX say they plan to do with this. They say it's to offer internet to everyone. I would argue it's so the military can surveil everything much more easily because, obviously all these things have military applications, and some of their older documents back when it was Teledesic and not SpaceX make this pretty explicit. In order to maintain this military hegemony, which, by the way, I brought this up a lot, these efforts to maintain American military and economic hegemony. This is all the U.S. establishment cares about. I want to make that really clear, specifically economic and military hegemony. They want to keep that at all costs. That's really all they care about, being at the top of the pecking order globally. So they'll do anything really to maintain that, regardless if it means erosion of civil liberties, ending democracy in the U.S. They'll really go as far as they feel like they need to go to maintain that on a global scale. So I want to make that explicit if I haven't already. So, if they're framing the whole UFO thing as we have to combat this unknown military technology, we're just going to see a lot more investment of the military in AI and emerging tech, which we're already seeing. This is being led by companies mostly tied to Peter Thiel, not just Palantir, who now is also a major military contractor, in addition to being a contractor to all 17 intelligence agencies, but also Anduril, which is a startup, a defense AI startup that's doing most of the autonomous weapons for the military, that's run by Palmer Luckey, who created Oculus Rift and sold it off to Facebook, and is also intimately connected to Peter Thiel. So if you know anything about Peter Thiel and his beliefs, political beliefs, he describes himself as libertarian, but he's not. He's an openly authoritarian, and a lot of the people that follow this writer, Curtis Yarvin, otherwise known as Mencius Moldbug, like Peter Thiel does, are pretty explicit about, this sort of monarchy, military dictatorship, where there's like a single leader type of style of government. It's very unsettling that these are the people in charge of developing a lot of this tech. So I would, urge people to pay attention to that for sure. But, there's an obvious agenda here with the UFO thing. I don't think there's any interest in the intelligence community actually telling people what's actually going on. They're going to do whatever plays most into their agenda. People need to keep in mind the CIA for decades has just been behind disinfo after disinfo operation, whether in the US or abroad. To think they wouldn't be doing that now, again, I think is naive. And, if they want to throw in the element of aliens in there, if they do that, they will have calculated exactly how they think that's going to affect the American public, how that's going to affect perception, public fear, among other things, and will be primed to manipulate that as soon as they release that information. So I think people need to be really skeptical about this stuff going forward. And, if you want to have your own beliefs about UFOs or aliens, feel free to do so, but I want to let the Pentagon or the top people at the Pentagon or the top people of the intelligence community inform your beliefs on that.
So, Whitney, if you have a couple minutes, I do have one question from a patron.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Primo Radical patrons, for just $1 a month, they can submit questions to all of my guests. I actually did have a question from Alex Edwards in Oregon. He wanted to know about the lab leak theory, but we've covered that. So Nick wanted to know, I heard via TrueAnon that you've got a book coming out on the relationship between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein. Can you share a few snippets or hints from the upcoming book?
My book isn't actually on Bill Gates and Epstein, but that's part of it. So the book is called One Nation Under Blackmail. It's basically a significant expansion of my original Epstein series, which is about not just Jeffrey Epstein, but the network that led to his existence, really, in terms of being an intelligence-linked sex trafficker of minors, an intelligence asset. So basically it starts, way back when that whole nexus formed, when this organized crime syndicate got in bed with intelligence, and what happened after that, and the ties of that nexus to Epstein. But in talking about Bill Gates specifically, that's going to be that's in the latter portion of the book, where I talk about Epstein after the sexual blackmail operation. But a lot of his interactions with Microsoft actually went on during that time. For people that want to know basically the full story, if you go to my website, unlimitedhangout.com, and you search for Bill Gates, you'll see the Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Gates article right away, and it's really all there. But in terms of some of the main points there, what originally piqued my interest in the Bill Gates, Jeffrey Epstein relationship, and why I knew the media was lying about the meeting in 2011, is because there's this 2001 article that was published in the UK newspaper called the Evening Standard, that was originally, it was before Epstein was infamous. It was about Prince Andrew's friendship with Ghislaine Maxwell. And of course, Epstein comes up in there. And it says, in describing Epstein at the time, it says that Epstein, his closest business partners were three men: Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and we know, of course, that the ties of Epstein to both of those men actually go back to the 1980s. But the third one is Bill Gates, and it's interesting to see Bill Gates mentioned in this article in such close connection with Epstein back in 2001, when mainstream media insists that they did not meet until 2011. So, of course, if you continue going down that rabbit hole, it becomes pretty clear that there was a lot of other stuff going on. Of course, the main giveaway is that Bill Gates had an obvious and admitted personal relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Isabel Maxwell. And Isabel Maxwell talks about that openly in a Guardian article from the year before, in 2000, about his dealings, as well as those with Paul Allen, the other Microsoft co-founder, in her business at the time that was called ComTouch, which is actually arguably a front for Israeli military intelligence, if you actually go and look at the history of that company that I've written about a couple of times over the past year or so. Beyond that, with Microsoft itself, Epstein, for some reason, had very close ties that are very suspicious to a couple top Microsoft executives, among them Steven Sinofsky, Linda Stone, and probably the most disturbing of all is going to be Nathan Myhrvold, who was Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft for a very long time, I think since 1996. He left in 2000, but continues to work relatively closely with Bill Gates through his intellectual ventures firm that he runs now. And basically, Myhrvold, a year after he became Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft, is on the flight manifest of Epstein's plane at least twice. Epstein travels with him to attend the Microsoft Russia conferences. There's photographs of this going on, and the claims later that Epstein would bring minors to Myhrvold's offices in the beginning of the 2000s, when he first left Microsoft and set up Intellectual Ventures, and then actually not just being accused by Virginia Giuffre of being one of the main predators that Epstein was enabling in targeting his victims, but also Alan Dershowitz basically said, yeah, Nathan Myhrvold was involved in this, which is pretty astounding, since Alan Dershowitz has been very vehement in his denials that he was involved in any bad activity. And when he was accused of such activity by Virginia Giuffre, he said, oh, no, it wasn't me, that was Nathan Myhrvold. So, there's a lot of evidence pointing to Nathan Myhrvold being involved in some dicey stuff during this period. But beyond that, a lot of the involvement with other top Microsoft people is very disconcerting, because it implies that, if Bill Gates was compromised, we have to ask the question, well, what if several of the top executives at Microsoft at the time were compromised, and what does that mean for Microsoft as a company and Microsoft products? So I would argue that a lot of the mainstream narrative that's come out about Gates and Epstein has been about damage control, in the sense of keeping it away from Microsoft and keep it focused on Bill Gates after Bill Gates was not necessarily as involved with Microsoft as he had been previously. And if they had, if mainstream media was forced to acknowledge what was going on in the 90s with Epstein and Microsoft in the early 2000s and all of this, specifically with the Edge Foundation as well, it would not turn out very pretty for Microsoft, which is a massive company that has a lot to lose, were this to come out. But it also shows, the mainstream media narrative about Epstein in general is, oh, this was one naughty billionaire doing bad things and he wasn't connected to anyone and he duped everyone else and it was just him, which, is clearly not the case. And it's just a way to absolve the U.S. establishment from having to investigate people like Leslie Wexner, among other people who obviously should be investigated for their role in what happened there. But it also, avoids having to deal with the issue of the intelligence ties of Epstein. And, when you bring that into the whole discussion about what was really going on with Epstein and Microsoft, was Microsoft compromised by a foreign intelligence agency and all of this stuff, it definitely starts to, become a massive scandal, potentially the biggest scandal in Microsoft's history. So I definitely think there's a vested interest in keeping it focused on Bill Gates himself, specifically in the years following, when he officially met Epstein, according to MSM, which is 2011. But even more than that, it's like focusing more on like 2013, 2014, when Melinda Gates allegedly was telling him to not be as involved with him. And by that point, I don't think he was even involved with Microsoft. I think he'd left Microsoft at that point. So they're definitely keeping the focus on behavior that happened in those years for a particular reason, I think.
Yeah, I know in particular, I was very frustrated by the documentary that came out last year on Epstein, how they completely whitewashed any kind of connection to the intelligence community whatsoever. So that was pretty frustrating. Whitney, I know we've gone much longer than we said we would. I hope that we can hope that you can come back on in the future to go over Epstein in particular, just because there's so much there. I know you could probably do a 12-hour interview just on Epstein. But yeah, thanks again for being on the show today. I appreciate you going over all of these different topics. For folks out there who would like to follow you and stay in touch with you, and I don't know if there's a way to support you now that you're off of Patreon, but how can they do that?
Okay, so you can find my work. Well, for now, I'm still on Twitter, but I mean, who knows how long that's going to last, right? Especially given what happened with Patreon. So you can follow my work on just going to my website, unlimitedhangout.com is probably the best way. There's a tab, Support Us. There you can sign up, in lieu of Patreon, since I don't have one anymore. You can sign up for a membership there and get access to the premium content I put out, which is mainly my podcast. And that also goes out on rockfin.com, ROKFIN.com, for people that prefer to use that platform, because there are a lot of creators on there. And if you pay, $10 a month, you get access to my premium content as well as everyone else's on the site, which include a lot of, the Empire Files are on there. Lee Camp, The Last American Vagabond, Jason Burmis, Combo Couch, a lot of people are on there. So if you're interested in their premium content as well as mine, that may be an option for you. But if you're not, you can just support, for much less money on my website as well, and get access to just my podcast through there. And in lieu of following my work on Twitter, I would recommend following my Telegram channel, because Telegram seems to not be as censorship extreme, except for now. But for now anyway. But it's pretty clear that a lot of these platforms, as they come under pressure over time, I think for people in independent media, it's just going to be a matter of platform hopping. I'm trying to do that as little as possible, because it's obviously a pain for my audience, right? But I would definitely encourage people to follow my work there as well. But if you go to my Twitter account and you look at the links, I have like a link tree there, and all the relevant links that you could possibly need to follow my work are all provided there as well, in case I left out any.
Yes, I actually also just recently opened up a Telegram. It seems as though a lot of people are shifting over there in anticipation of being deplatformed. So I encourage everybody who's watching and listening, please do open up a Telegram account. Please follow me at Primo Radical, and follow Whitney So yeah, thanks again, Whitney. I really do appreciate you coming on the show and going over all these topics. Again, I hope that I can have you back at some point in the future to go into Epstein in particular and whatever the current breaking news is at that point. So thank you again for your time.
Yeah, sure, no problem. And I'm sure closer to when the book's coming out in a couple months, I'd be happy to come back on and go all over Epstein and all of that. And hopefully then I'll be a little less sleep deprived. So that would be nice. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks.